reasons we can share, but unfortunately, time fails me.
Well, good evening, and welcome to Amplified. I hope you've had a great night so far. We've got some fun things planned for you guys, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this message with you guys tonight. Now, tonight we're going to be looking, as your handout says, we're going to be looking again at the book of Daniel in a message that I have entitled Faith by Fire. Faith by Fire. And so, if you haven't guessed, the theme tonight is going to be faith. And this stool here can represent our faith. It looks strong, it looks sturdy, and it looks like we could easily sit on it. But faith, like this stool, is different than belief. Belief is looking at this stool and going, well, it looks sturdy enough, I bet it could hold me up. But I'm good. I'm just going to sit back here. I believe that that's a stool. I believe it can hold me up. I believe it can help me out. But I'm going to be here. Faith, on the other hand, is actually coming and saying, you know, not only do I see this stool, but I believe that it can hold me up, and actually sitting down on the stool. All right? And showing that we've put our trust and our faith in the stool, that it will hold our weight. Now here's the problem. As we grow in our lives, people try to shoot holes in our faith. All right? And they tell us that there is no God. They tell us that you're weird for going to church. They say, where is God when you are hurting? Sometimes we go through difficult times, and it's difficult to understand where God is in those hard times. And as we grow, our faith becomes a little bit shaky, a little bit rocky. And we don't know, I don't know if I can trust that. And we don't know if we can trust and put our full faith into God because we've been lied to, or we've been deceived, or we've gone through things that make us doubt our faith. And so tonight we're going to look at an example of three men who had no doubt in their faith and who knew their faith was strong. Most of you have probably heard this story. It is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. So as we get into this story, I want to ask you one question. How shaky is your faith? How shaky is your faith? Let's look at our story. Our story tonight begins in chapter 3, but I'm actually going to back up to give you a review because we've had a fourth Wednesday since the last time we met. So 2 weeks ago, we looked in Daniel 1, where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken from Israel into Babylon, and they were forced to undergo 3 years of assimilation. But they fought that assimilation, and they won, and they were seen as better and greater than any of the other king's advisors when they were appointed to be Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon's advisors. Well, in chapter 2, something interesting happens. King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this dream really, really, really bothers him. And he has it a couple of days in a row. So he goes to his wisest advisors of Babylon, and he looks at them and he goes, look, guys, I've had this dream, and I need you to interpret it for me. And they go, okay, tell us what the dream is, and we'll interpret it for you. He goes, no. I don't want to give you the dream. I want to make sure that you know what's going on. So not only do you have to give me the interpretation, but I want you to tell me the dream and then interpret it. And so they start stalling, and they start trying to figure out and helping and get these things worked out. And they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. And finally, King Nebuchadnezzar, he starts to get frustrated. And he finally goes, look, if you guys can't solve this, I'm going to rip you limb from limb, and your houses will become dumps. All right? That's what he tells them. So they freak out. They scatter. They go, well, okay, we'll come back tomorrow. We'll let you know. And they take off. Well, the next day comes. King Nebuchadnezzar sends out one of his royal guard to go and rip all of his wise advisor arm, or rip all of his wise advisors limb from limb, and turn their house into dumps. Well, one of these advisors is Daniel. And Daniel goes, well, what's going on? I don't even know what's happening. And he tells him what happens, and he goes, let me talk to you. And so he goes to the king, and he asks for another few days to contemplate and see if he can determine what the dream was in the interpretation. So he goes, and the king grants him permission. He gets Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego together. They pray all night long, and finally God reveals to Daniel the dream. And he goes to the king, and he goes, King Nebuchadnezzar, here's your dream, and here's what it means. And it blows Nebuchadnezzar away. He goes, how'd you know my dream? How'd you figure it out? Your God is awesome. I love your God. And the dream went something like this. The dream was a statue. And that statue, the head was made of gold, then silver for the shoulders and torso. The hips and thighs were made of bronze, and the feet and ankles were made of iron and clay. All right? And so then out of nowhere comes this rock, and it strikes the iron and clay, and it shatters, and the whole statue comes crumbling down, and that small rock turns into a giant mountain. And Daniel looks at him and he says, the statue represents you, King Nebuchadnezzar. You're the head of gold. And after you will come a kingdom of silver, a kingdom of bronze, and then a kingdom of iron and clay. And that rock represents my God, who will come and he will shatter all that the kingdoms have built before, and he will rise up and establish his kingdom on this earth. And Nebuchadnezzar is blown away. And he's like, holy cow, I can't believe this. This is unbelievable. How did you know that? And he's so excited and he's so happy that they knew the dream and they gave him an interpretation that he promoted them to chief advisors and gave them rule over the provinces of Babylon. Well, chapter 3, where our story for tonight picks up, King Nebuchadnezzar liked that dream. In fact, he liked it so much that he decided he was going to build a statue of his own. And he builds a gold statue of himself, and he tells the whole land, when the music plays, you will bow down and worship this statue of me, because I am like a God. And so sure enough, the music plays, and everybody in the land bows down, except for 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, we don't know where Daniel is. He's probably out doing business for the king, and he's not in Babylon at the time when this happens, because he's not mentioned in this story, but he later reemerges in the rest of the book. But these 3 did not bow down to the idols. Well, the other advisors, who already didn't like these Jewish advisors who were better than they were, they ran to King Nebuchadnezzar to tattle on him. And they're like, hey, you know those Jewish guys that you are think of so highly? Well, they didn't bow down and worship you when the music played. He gets upset. And he calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He calls them to himself. And he goes, hey, look, they said you didn't bow down. And here's the deal. I kind of like you guys, but I'm going to give you a second chance. And he says, when you're ready, I'll play the music, and you can bow down and worship me, and everything will be great. But if you don't, I'm going to chuck you into the furnace. And so he goes, so are you guys ready? Because you've got to be ready, because what God can save you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego look at him, and they go, we don't even need to give your question a response, because we're not going to worship your gods. Our God will protect us and deliver us from whatever you bring towards us. But even, and this was so crazy to me, but even if he doesn't, we want you to know that we worship our God and are not going to bow before you or in worship any of your gods. Nebuchadnezzar is furious, completely upset. He's so upset that he immediately says, bind them and let's take them to the furnace. He tells them to set the furnace to be 7 times hotter than it normally is. And so it's raging and it's super hot. And they start taking these 3 men up to the top to throw them in the furnace. The furnace is so hot that the prison guards who are carrying him to the furnace die. As they're carrying these men, they die from the heat, and the 3 men fall into the furnace in what would seem like their death. But then Nebuchadnezzar is sitting there. And he's looking into the furnace. He's feeling pretty proud of himself. Look, I squelched that rebellion. I'm cool. And he looks in there. And he's looking in and he's like, what? And then he jumps up from his seat. And he goes, hey, how many people did we throw into that furnace? And they're like, 3. And he goes, then why is there 4? Why are they walking around and why aren't they tied up anymore? What is going on? And he runs close to the furnace. And he looks in and he can't believe what he says. He says, the 4th one looks like the Son of God. And he gets crazy. He's getting excited. And he's astonished at what he sees. And he calls to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he says, come out. Let me look at you. What is going on? And they come walking out of the furnace. And as they examine them, the ropes that they were tied with are gone. But not a hair is singed. Not a piece of clothing is burned. And in fact, it says you couldn't even smell they didn't even have the smell of smoke on their clothes. And he's astonished. And he looks at these men and he goes, great is the God of Israel. And he says, if anybody in the nation, and he makes a decree and sends it out to all of the world, he goes, if anybody says a harsh word towards the God of Israel, I will rip them limb from limb and I will make their house a dump. Evidently, that was his favorite saying because he says it a lot. And so he tells them that. And then he's so astonished, the 3 men that he just tried to kill because they were treasonous and they rebelled against him, he promotes them to even higher positions in his kingdom because he is so astonished. And we can see how God delivered his 3 missionaries to Babel. And our story ends up well for these 3 young men. But it was hard for them to stand for their faith. And our first faith lesson of the night is this: our faith will be challenged. Our faith will be challenged. Guys, this isn't something that just happened during Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's days. This isn't something that that doesn't happen anymore. All right? This is something that we have to deal with and face today. But the difference is this: they were forced to. When they were facing this, it wasn't like us. For us, we may get made fun of. We may lose a friend. We may be bullied a little bit. But these guys were facing death. They were facing treason and insubordination. And that's what they had to live with. That's what they had to deal with. And they stood firm in their faith. So here's the question. We don't face such crazy and steep odds, do we? We don't have to worry about being put to death for our faith. We may have to deal with being made fun of, being bullied, maybe losing a friend or being unpopular. But here's the deal. Do you stand like they stood when we're facing much less of a consequence than what they faced? When a friend comes up and makes fun of you, do you wither, fall away, and denounce what you believe? Or do you stand firm for the God that saved you? How shaky is your faith? How firm can it be? Our second faith lesson is this: we must stand firm in our faith. We must stand firm in our faith. And this is important Because just like they stood firm, we need to learn to stand firm. And one of the best ways we can do that is to make the big decisions now. Make the big decisions now. Okay? So that way, when we face the question, what God can save you from my power, we can say, my God can. Because we've made the decision. When I was in high school, I made a big decision. I said, you know what? I'm never going to drink alcohol. I just don't want to do it. And I didn't do it because the Bible says not to or any of those reasons. I didn't do it because I was afraid it would affect my ability to play sports. And so I made that promise, hey, I'm not going to drink alcohol. And to this day, I live by that. And I don't have to worry about it because that decision is already made. Later, after I graduated high school and I was in college, I made the decision that I was going to live for God and put my faith in Him no matter what. And that's what I wanted to do. And I made that big decision then, and it's never let me down since. So we need to make the big decisions now. Because we're going to face persecution. We're going to face being made fun of. We're going to face all of that not only now, but throughout our lives. So why leave it to doubt? Just say you're going to stand no matter what happens and no matter how it goes. Make the big decision now and stand for your faith. Because here's the deal. No one would have blamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego if they would have just conformed like everybody else. They could have easily said, hey, everybody else is doing it, why shouldn't we? And no one would have looked at them and said, well, I get it. You know, they're going to be thrown in a furnace. Everybody else was doing it, so what's the big deal? And they could have easily conformed. And we're in the same situation. Our world today is running headlong as hard and as fast as they can away from God. Away from the ways that He teaches. And it would be real easy for us to just fall in line and go with them. And conform. Because everybody else is doing it, why shouldn't we? But that's not what God calls us to do. He calls us to stand firm. And here's why. Adversity leads to opportunity for God's glory to shine. Adversity leads to opportunity for God's glory to shine. Let me explain this. I mentioned to you that I made big decisions when I was in high school and when I was in college. I said I'd never drink alcohol and that I was going to stand for God no matter what. Well, when I entered into college, I was privileged enough and blessed enough to be able to play college baseball. And I joined the team, and it was fantastic. I loved it. It was one of the best years of my life. And I got to know these guys. We hung out as a team. We did things as a team. And I went everywhere that the team went because we were all part of a team. However, most of this team was over 21, and those that weren't didn't really care. And so a lot of times when we would go to places, everybody was drinking. But I had already made the big decision. I didn't have to worry about it. I knew what my answer would be. I'm not going to drink. I'm going to stand for God. I'm going to live the way that God asked me to live, and I'm going to be a beacon for Him. And so I did that. Well, one night, we were all hanging out together over at a friend's house, and everybody was drinking, and I had a nice, cold Dr. Pepper, and I was drinking that sweet nectar down, and it was so delicious. But all of a sudden, a couple of the rougher guys on the team started giving me a hard time. Hey, why don't you switch out that Dr. Pepper for a beer? I go, nah, I'm good. I don't drink, no big deal. And they're like, yeah, it is. We're all a team. You need to join in with us. Come on, why don't you do it? And they just kept after me. They kept after me. They kept after me. And I just kept denying them because I'd already made the big decision. It didn't bother me what they thought. Well, then I was talking to one of my friends, and I wasn't paying attention. And all of a sudden, I felt this cold, wet liquid begin to pour over my head. And I turned around and looked up, and one of those guys who'd been making fun of me decided it'd be fun to pour his beer on my head. Now, luckily for me, I had a lot of friends on this baseball team. All right? and one of the seniors on the team grabbed his hand and grabbed the bottle and said, "Dude, just leave the guy alone." And the guy walked off. But I was still wet, sticky, and I smelled like beer. But I didn't change. None of that changed me. I'd already made the big decisions. And throughout the rest of the year, I still hung out with the team. I never drank once. I was living for him. I never cussed. I never did any of the things that they did, that they asked me to do. And I just kept living for God because that was the big decision that I had made. And at the end of the year, we had packed up all of our stuff. I cleared out my locker, and I was heading back to my dorm room. And I'm running away, and all of a sudden, from behind me, I hear, "Hey, neighbors, wait up!" And I go, "Oh, great," because I recognize the voice. And I turn around, and sure enough, it's that guy who was pouring the beer on my head, right? And I go, "Oh, man, what did I do now? What does he want?" But I put on a smile, and I turned around, and I went walking towards him, and I go, "What's up, man?" And he goes, "Hey, I want to tell you something." And I'm like, "Oh, gosh, what is it this time?" And he goes, "Hey, you're a pretty cool dude." And I go, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, man, you earned a lot of my respect." And I go, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "There's something different about you. Most of the time, when people say something, they don't live up to it. But no matter what you said, you did. And what you said you weren't going to do, you wouldn't do." And he goes, "I appreciate that. What's different about you?" And I got to look at this guy, and I got to tell him who Jesus was. And I got to tell him what Jesus had done in my life and why I lived the way I lived. He didn't accept Christ that day, but I still pray to this day that God would put somebody else in his life or lead him back to Christ so that one day we can be together in God's kingdom. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if God was going to deliver me from this persecution, if you want to call it. I mean, that's just one story. Like I said, when the guy came up to me afterwards, that wasn't the first and it wasn't the last time he had bullied me or said different things. But at the end of the day, I made the big decision. I'm putting my faith in God. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to cuss. I'm not going to do any of those things. And I stayed by it because the decision was already made. And God delivered me. But here's the deal. I didn't know He was going to deliver me. I had no clue that I would have the opportunity to impact that young man. I had no clue that he would come after me and that he would be impacted by what I had done throughout the year. For all I knew, he could have just kept bullying me for the rest of the next 3 years. But he did. God delivered me. Just like God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fire. But here's the deal I want to tell you. Both those stories worked out well. But that's not always the way it works out. God doesn't always deliver in the way we want. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew that. In verse 17 of chapter 3, they say, if the God we serve exists, then He can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire. And He can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if He does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your God or worship the gold statue you set up. They didn't know if God was going to save them from the furnace. But that didn't stop them from standing firm. We don't know if God will deliver us because He's got a plan and a purpose for each and every one of us. I've often, in counseling people and talking to people, I've often heard them say, well, me and God, we made a deal, all right? And if God gets me through this trial, then I'm going to do this for Him. And if God does this for me, then I'm going to do this for Him. God doesn't bargain, guys. That's not what He does. God isn't here to bargain. He's got a purpose and a plan, and He will enact it as He goes. All right? Standing firm doesn't mean that we have to defend God. He'll defend Himself. But it also doesn't mean that God will deliver us in the way we want. But here's our third faith lesson, and it's probably the most important. God's glory will be on display regardless of the outcome. Regardless of the outcome. I want us to look at King Nebuchadnezzar here for a second. When this whole furnace thing started, he was pretty upset, right? He was pretty angry. He was furious, if you will. He was so furious that he had to make the fire 7 times hotter. He immediately had them bound and taken directly to the furnace, right? In fact, some of the other ancient Greek texts that we have, such as the Song of the Three Young Men and the Prayer of Azariah, they tell us that the fire was 75 feet. The flames were 75 feet above the top of the furnace. That's how hot the fire was. That's a lot of fire, guys. And he threw them in there. And it was so hot that it killed the guards who were supposed to be throwing them in there. They weren't even in the furnace. They were on the outside. And the heat from that killed them. But then he looked into the fire. And he was astonished. He couldn't believe what he had seen. And he sees them walking around. He's astonished. Because you see, we have to understand from this story that there's more to God's glory than deliverance. Right? There's more to this story and to God's plan and purpose than God saving the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sure, that's one of the very important things. Right? But there was 2 others. The second one is this. What did Nebuchadnezzar say? If anyone says a bad word about the God of Israel, I will rip them limb from limb and make their house a dung. So now, Nebuchadnezzar, who just built a gold statue to be worshipped and to worship his God, has just made a statement that the God of Israel is greater than his God. And he's decreed it to the whole land. So now all of Babylon knows that the God of Israel is real, and he's so real that he's more important than Nebuchadnezzar's favorite God. And then the next thing he did, he promoted those 3 men one more time, didn't he? He made them leaders and governors over provinces of Babylon. And so now God's leaders, his chosen men, are leading and governing all of Babylon. And there's a huge change that comes from the start to the end. Because God's glory will always be on display, regardless of the outcome. And that brings us back to our stool. God asks us to stand firm, right? But just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were facing insubordination, they were facing treason, they were facing death. And it's real easy for us to look at our faith and go, man, that's real shaky. I don't know if I can trust that. I don't know if I can even sit on that because it may not hold me up. I don't know if God can deliver me. And we look at our faith and we examine our faith and we try to figure out if we can make it happen or how can our faith get firm. But the truth is, we rely on our own ways to make our faith strong. We forget to rely on God. We forget to look to Him for the strength, and we try to make it our own faith. But the truth is this: God wants us to stand for our faith. Now, when I first started this, I said we get to sit. That's not what God wants. God calls us to stand for our faith. And when He calls us to stand, it'll be solid. And it won't be shaken. And it won't be firm. Because God, when He calls us to stand, He will be solid for us. And there's nothing that can change that. You see, God sent His Son into the furnace to spare those 3 men. But God sent his Son to the cross so that we could be delivered through our faith. And so that we can stand, not sit, so we can stand firm in our faith on God and trust that he will hold us up and he will see us through. Regardless of the outcome, he will see us through. He'll be there for us when we need to be faithful. So the question is this: how shaken is your faith? And can you stand firm with God today? Let's bow our heads. There may be some of you here today